Today, it seems unbelievable, but lobotomy was once celebrated as a miracle cure, described by doctors and the media as easier than curing a toothache. In the UK alone, more than 20,000 lobotomies were performed between the early 1940s and the late 1970s. Lobotomies were usually carried out on patients with schizophrenia, severe depression, or obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. In some cases, it was also an option for patients with learning disabilities or aggression control. Although a minority felt symptomatic improvements after the procedure, some remained groggy, unable to communicate, walk, or feed themselves. But it took years for health professionals to realize that the negative effects outweighed the benefits. Medications developed in the 1950s proved to be more effective and much safer. Lobotomy was a cruel and terrible procedure, but it was extraordinarily successful for a while. So how did this method come about? That's what we're going to explain in today's video. Lobotomists were often progressive reformers, driven by the desire to improve their patients' lives. In the 1940s, there were no effective treatments for the seriously mentally ill. Doctors had tried insulin shock therapy and electroconvulsive therapy, but success was limited. The asylums were crowded with patients who had no hope of being cured or of returning home. In this context, the Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz developed prefrontal leukotomy, later called lobotomy, allowing psychosurgery to emerge. This innovation earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1949, shared with Swiss physiologist Walter Rudolf Hess. This procedure involved drilling 2 holes in the skull and inserting a pointed instrument into the brain tissue. The tool was then moved back and forth to sever the connections between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain. Egas Moniz's idea was straightforward. It was based on a crude and simplistic notion of the brain, which saw it as a simple mechanism into which one could simply put things. The idea was that obsessive and distressing thoughts were constantly spinning, and by interrupting the circuit, it would be possible to halt them. But the brain is extremely complex, and we still haven't even begun to understand how everything is interconnected. Moniz said that his first 20 patients experienced dramatic improvements, and a young American neurologist, Walter Freeman, was overly impressed with the method. With his partner James Watts, he performed the first lobotomy in the US in 1936. The following year, the newspaper The New York Times called the operation the New Surgery of the Soul. At first, the procedure was complicated and time-consuming. Freeman aimed to make lobotomy quicker and cheaper. In 1946, he developed the transorbital lobotomy, where steel instruments, which looked more like ice spikes, were hammered into the brain through the delicate bones at the back of the eye sockets. The operating time was drastically reduced, and patients didn't need anesthesia. They were simply knocked out with a portable electroshock machine. With the success of this physically brutal procedure, Freeman traveled around the United States during extensive summer vacations to perform his ice-pick lobotomies, sometimes taking his children with him. While it was initially described as a last resort surgery for psychiatric patrons whose other treatments had failed, Freeman began promoting lobotomy as a cure for everything, including severe mental illness, postpartum depression, migraines, chronic pain, nervous indigestion, insomnia, and behavioral difficulties. Many patients and their families were extremely grateful to Freeman, who kept thank you letters and Christmas cards sent by them in boxes. But in other cases, the results were catastrophic. Freeman's patients included Rosemary Kennedy, sister of future US President John F. Kennedy, who was left incontinent and unable to speak clearly after a 23-year lobotomy. Over the course of his career, Freeman performed lobotomies on 3,500 patients, including 19 children, the youngest just 4 years old. In the UK, Freeman's equivalent was neurosurgeon Sir Willy Mckisic, who performed his own variation of the lobotomy on around 3,000 patients. This is not a time-consuming operation. A skilled team in an organized psychiatric hospital can do 4 such operations in 2 to 2.5 hours, he boasted. Bilateral prefrontal leukotomy can be done by a qualified neurosurgeon in 6 minutes and rarely takes more than 10, he added. Much due to Mckisic, more lobotomies per capita were performed in the United Kingdom than in the United States. As a medical student in the 1970s, Henry Marsh took a job as a nursing assistant in a psychiatric hospital, describing it as the terminal ward that dealt with lost cases. It was there that he saw firsthand the devastating effects of lobotomy. It was painful to realize that there was no proper follow-up for these patients, he says. The worst patients, the most apathetic, the most desperate, were those who had had a lobotomy. They had all been operated on by Mckisic and his assistants. Later, when Marsh qualified as a neurosurgeon, a modification of the procedure was used, known as limbic leucotomy. Marsh describes it as a kind of microscopic version, more refined compared to the lobotomies people had been doing for decades. He performed this operation on a dozen patients with severe OCD in 1990. All the patients were suicidal, who had not been successful with other treatments. It was something that particularly worried me, he said. I didn't see the patients afterwards. It was purely technical. The psychiatrist involved assured me that the operations had been a success, he adds. Asked how he felt about these operations, he confessed that, I didn't like doing them, and I was very happy to quit surgical practice. In the early 1960s, around 500 lobotomies were performed annually in the UK, compared to a peak of 1,500. In the mid-1970s, this number dropped to around 100 to 150 a year, almost always involving smaller cuts and more precise targets. The enactment of the Mental Health Act of 1983 established stricter controls and greater supervision. Today, psychosurgical operations are rarely performed. Lobotomy received criticism from the start. Opposition to the procedure grew stronger as poor results became evident. Walter Freeman, who initially claimed an 85% success rate, actually had a 15% mortality rate. And when doctors investigated the long-term results of his patients, they found that only a third had felt relative improvements, while another third had gotten worse. A former lobotomy advocate in the US said, lobotomy was as subtle as a shot to the head. 15 years earlier, a group of doctors and lobotomy victims and their families campaigned to have the Nobel Prize taken away from Egas Moniz. The Nobel Foundation, whose articles of association state that the prizes cannot be withdrawn, refused. After several people suffered from this terrible and violent procedure, lobotomy was banned. Patients with bipolar disorder, depression, hyperactivity, or disobedient children were given black box medication.